Hey everyone, comment where you're watching from today. This story is about a moment that changed everything in a Cleveland courthouse, where a judge's laughter turned into stunned silence. The prestigious halls of the Cleveland County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation that morning. The marble floors echoed with footsteps as attorneys and clients hurried to their respective courtrooms. Among them walked Usha Vance, a first-generation immigrant who had worked her way through law school while raising 3 children. Her weathered briefcase, held together by determination more than leather, contained documents that would soon shake the foundations of a corrupt system. Judge Thomas Clark sat elevated on his bench, his expensive robes a stark contrast to Usha's modest business suit. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows caught the gold accents of his ceremonial attire, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including Barbara Williams, a veteran court reporter who had seen it all, or so she thought. The case seemed straightforward at first. Usha Vance was representing Sandra Martinez, a local teacher who had lost everything to a fraudulent investment scheme. The defendant, represented by the prestigious Richard Anderson of Anderson and Moore law firm, sat confidently beside his attorney, barely acknowledging the presence of the woman whose life savings he had taken. As Usha approached the podium, Judge Clark's demeanor shifted. He glanced at Richard Anderson, exchanging a look that didn't go unnoticed by Barbara Williams, who had been documenting court proceedings for over 2 decades. The judge's next words would set the tone for what was about to unfold. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Clark's voice carried a hint of condescension, "I understand this is your first time presenting a case in my courtroom?" The question hung in the air, loaded with presumption. "Yes, Your Honor," Usha replied, her voice steady despite the judge's tone. "However, I've extensively prepared for this case and dash." A chuckle escaped Judge Clark's lips, cutting her off. "Preparation is one thing, Mrs. Vance, but experience is another. This is a complex financial case. Perhaps your client would be better served by someone more seasoned." The gallery stirred. Michael Thompson, a young law clerk, looked up from his notes, his eyes widening at the judge's unusual display of bias. But Usha remained composed, her years of facing adversity evident in her unwavering stance. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured, "with all due respect, my experience extends far beyond this courtroom. Before pursuing law, I spent 15 years as a forensic accountant specializing in investment fraud." The judge's smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Is that so? And where exactly did you conduct this work?" "Some small local firm, perhaps." "Actually, Your Honor, I was the lead investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission's task force on investment fraud from 2015 to 2020. I personally uncovered the largest Ponzi scheme in Ohio's history during my tenure." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. Elizabeth Martinez, a senior partner at one of Cleveland's top law firms who had stopped by to observe what she thought would be a routine case, leaned forward in her seat. The judge's expression tightened as he realized his mistake. But Usha wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I've spent the last 6 months meticulously documenting a pattern of similar investment schemes across 3 states, all connecting back to the defendant's organization. The evidence I'm about to present doesn't just prove my client's case, it exposes a network of fraud that has targeted hundreds of victims." Judge Clark's face had lost its condescending smile. Richard Anderson shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. From her position at the stenograph, Barbara Williams noticed the defendant's hands beginning to tremble. "I have here," Usha continued, pulling documents from her worn briefcase, certified records from 7 different financial institutions, documenting a trail of shell companies and fraudulent transactions. Each document has been verified by both state and federal authorities. The judge's earlier laughter had evaporated completely. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Usha methodically laid out her evidence, piece by piece. Her quiet confidence and thorough preparation stood in stark contrast to the judge's earlier dismissive attitude. Sarah Davis, another attorney waiting for her case to be called, whispered to Jennifer Clark beside her, "She just schooled them all." Jennifer nodded, a smile of admiration crossing her face. As Usha presented her final piece of evidence, Judge Clark cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Mrs. Vance, I apologize for my earlier remarks. Please proceed with your case." The gallery watched as Usha continued her presentation, her voice never rising, her demeanor remaining professional despite the judge's earlier derision. She methodically outlined how the defendant had systematically targeted teachers, nurses, and other hardworking professionals, promising them secure investments while funneling their money through a complex web of fake companies. Linda Wilson, a veteran courthouse security officer, would later remark that she had never seen such a complete transformation in a courtroom. The judge, who had started the session with dismissive laughter, was now hanging on every word, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing concern as the magnitude of the case became clear. The morning wore on, and Usha's presentation continued to unravel years of carefully constructed fraud. Michael Johnson, a junior partner at Anderson and Moore who had been sent to observe, quietly slipped out of the courtroom, his face pale as he realized the implications for his firm. By the time Usha concluded her initial presentation, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely. Judge Clark, now sitting forward in his chair, had been taking extensive notes. Richard Anderson had loosened his expensive tie, his earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. "Your Honor," Usha concluded, "this case is about more than just my client's lost savings. It's about justice for hundreds of victims who trusted a system that failed them. It's about holding accountable those who believe their positions of power and privilege place them above the law." The irony of her words, given the judge's earlier behavior, was lost on no one. Barbara Williams' fingers flew across her stenograph, knowing she was documenting a moment that would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. Judge Clark cleared his throat again, this time with a different kind of discomfort. "Mrs. Vance, I believe we'll need to expand the scope of these proceedings. Given the evidence you've presented, I'm ordering an immediate freeze on all associated accounts and scheduling an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning." As the judge issued his orders, Sandra Martinez, Usha's client, wiped tears from her eyes. The woman who had lost everything was beginning to see hope for the first time in months. Beside her, Margaret Moore, another victim who had been watching the proceedings, reached over to squeeze her hand in solidarity. The defendant, who had started the morning with a dismissive smirk matching the judge's, now sat ashen-faced as federal marshals entered the courtroom. The evidence Usha presented hadn't just won her client's case. It had triggered a federal investigation that would soon uncover one of the largest financial fraud operations in the state's history. As the courtroom began to clear, Elizabeth Martinez approached Usha. "That was masterful," she said, extending her card. "We should talk about your future plans." Usha smiled politely but turned to her client first. "Let's focus on getting your life back together," she said to Sandra Martinez, packing away her documents in her worn briefcase. "This is just the beginning." The morning sun still streamed through the courthouse windows, but now it illuminated a very different scene from the one it had witnessed hours earlier. A judge's laughter had been replaced by silence, arrogance by humility, and dismissal by respect. Have you ever been underestimated? Has anyone ever laughed at your dreams or dismissed your capabilities? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes, the most powerful response to mockery is simply proving them wrong through your actions and expertise. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of justice served and underdogs triumphant. The next morning arrived with an intensity that seemed to charge the very air of the Cleveland County Courthouse. News of yesterday's revelations had spread rapidly through the legal community, and the expanded courtroom was filled to capacity. Karen Thompson, the court administrator, had to arrange for additional seating as more victims of the investment scheme came forward, drawn by the hope that Usha Vance had ignited. Judge Thomas Clark entered the courtroom with a markedly different demeanor from the previous day. Gone was the condescending smile, replaced by a grave expression that spoke volumes about the night he'd spent reviewing Usha's evidence. The defendant's table had expanded as well, now occupied by a team of attorneys led by William Martin, a high-powered lawyer rushed in from Chicago overnight. Usha Vance arrived early, her same weathered briefcase in hand. But today, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked Lisa Wilson, a federal prosecutor whose presence sent ripples of whispers through the gallery. The partnership that had formed overnight between Usha and the federal authorities spoke volumes about the magnitude of what she had uncovered. "Your Honor," Usha began, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence as before, "with the court's permission, I'd like to present additional evidence that came to light overnight." The judge, chastened by his previous mistake, nodded respectfully. "Please proceed, Mrs. Vance." What followed was a masterclass in investigative legal work. Usha began projecting a complex web of financial transactions onto the courtroom screen. Barbara Garcia, a forensic accountant from the FBI who had worked through the night with Usha, stood ready to testify. "What you're seeing," Usha explained, "is not just a single fraudulent investment scheme, but a decades-long pattern of systematic exploitation." Her laser pointer traced lines between seemingly unrelated companies, all leading back to a central hub controlled by the defendant. William Martin rose to object, but Usha was prepared. "Your Honor, every connection I'm about to demonstrate is supported by certified bank records, corporate filings, and sworn affidavits from former employees." The gallery watched in rapt attention as Usha methodically exposed how the scheme had evolved over years. Susan Thompson, a retired teacher who had lost her pension, clutched her daughter's hand as the full scope of the fraud became clear. The defendant's sophisticated operation had specifically targeted educators, medical professionals, and civil servants, people who had dedicated their lives to serving others. The genius of this scheme, Usha continued, was its apparent legitimacy. "Margaret Davis, would you please stand?" A dignified woman in her 60s rose from the gallery. Mrs. Davis served as a school principal for 30 years. When she invested her retirement savings, she was shown legitimate-looking documents, given tours of real offices, and introduced to seemingly successful investors, all carefully orchestrated to create an illusion of security. The defendant's legal team shifted uncomfortably as Usha projected their clients' bank records. These documents showed transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Switzerland, all carefully layered to avoid detection. But there was one detail they overlooked. Judge Clark leaned forward, his earlier skepticism completely forgotten. "And what was that, Mrs. Vance?" They never expected someone with both financial fraud investigation experience and legal training to connect the dots. The sophisticated nature of this scheme was also its weakness. It required such complex documentation that, once you knew where to look, the pattern became clear. Robert Harris, one of the defendant's attorneys, whispered urgently to William Martin, who had begun to look increasingly concerned. The evidence Usha was presenting wasn't just damaging to their client, it implicated several prominent law firms in facilitating the fraud. As the morning progressed, Usha introduced Jessica Gonzalez, a former employee of the defendant who had become a whistleblower. Jessica's testimony corroborated every detail of Usha's investigation, adding human context to the paper trail. She described how the organization had specifically trained its sales team to target vulnerable populations, using their dreams of a secure retirement as weapons against them. "Your Honor," Usha said, approaching the bench with a new set of documents, "what makes this case particularly egregious is the deliberate targeting of public servants. The defendant's internal documents show they specifically sought out teachers, nurses, and social workers, people who had spent their lives helping others and had built up modest but significant retirement savings." The courtroom grew silent as Usha played an audio recording. The defendant's voice, clear and unmistakable, could be heard instructing his team to focus on the bleeding hearts. They trust easily and don't ask too many questions. Several victims in the gallery wiped away tears as their worst suspicions were confirmed. Sandra Hernandez, another victim who had lost her life savings, stood up suddenly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge, against usual protocol, nodded, perhaps feeling he owed a debt of humility after his previous day's behavior. "I was a nurse for 40 years, Sandra began, her voice trembling but determined. "When they came to our hospital with their investment presentation, they knew exactly what to say. They talked about helping others, about ethical investment strategies. They used our own values against us." Usha gently guided the discussion back to the evidence, but Sandra's words had landed with powerful impact. The human cost of the fraud was now undeniable, written on the faces of dozens of victims in the gallery. As the lunch break approached, Usha introduced perhaps her most damaging evidence yet. These emails, Your Honor, show that the defendant's organization didn't just defraud these hardworking Americans, they actively celebrated it. The projected emails showed the defendant and his associates joking about their victims, referring to them as easy marks, and planning how to spend their ill-gotten gains. The defendant, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout the morning, finally showed signs of cracking, his face reddening with each new revelation. Linda Robinson, a veteran courtroom deputy, would later remark that she had never seen such a complete dismantling of a fraudulent enterprise in her 20 years of service. Usha's presentation wasn't just thorough, it was devastating in its precision and humanity. The afternoon session began with an unexpected development. Michael Brown, a senior partner at one of Cleveland's most prestigious law firms, asked to address the court. His firm had unwittingly helped process some of the fraudulent transactions, and he had spent the morning break reviewing Usha's evidence. Your Honor, Michael began, in light of Mrs. Vance's presentation, our firm wishes to cooperate fully with this investigation. We have already begun compiling all relevant documents and will make them available to the court immediately. This announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community present in the courtroom. Christopher Anderson, another prominent attorney who had been observing the proceedings, quickly followed suit, offering his firm's cooperation as well. Usha acknowledged these offers with a gracious nod, but her focus remained unwavering. She proceeded to demonstrate how the defendant's scheme had begun to unravel only when Sarah Jackson, a young accounting clerk, had noticed discrepancies in some routine paperwork and reported them to her superiors. This case, Usha continued, illustrates both the worst and best of human nature. We've seen calculated greed and exploitation, but we've also seen courage from whistleblowers like Jessica Gonzalez, from victims willing to come forward, and from professionals willing to acknowledge and correct their unwitting involvement in this fraud. As the afternoon wore on, the defendant's legal team appeared increasingly defeated. William Martin's objections became less frequent and more perfunctory. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the documentation too thorough, the testimony too consistent. Judge Clark, who had started the previous day laughing at Usha, now watched her with undisguised admiration. Her presentation had not only exposed a massive fraud but had done so in a way that maintained the highest standards of legal professionalism. The day concluded with Usha submitting a final set of documents, evidence that the fraud extended beyond Ohio's borders, potentially affecting thousands more victims across multiple states. The implications were staggering, and the judge immediately ordered the case details to be shared with federal authorities in neighboring jurisdictions. As the courtroom began to clear, Nancy Thomas, one of the victims, approached Usha. "Thank you," she said simply, tears in her eyes. "We had lost hope until you came along." Usha's response captured the essence of her character. Hope is never lost when people stand together for justice. This is just the beginning of making things right. Have you ever witnessed someone underestimated turn the tables on those who doubted them? Share your stories of triumph over prejudice in the comments below. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths. Like and subscribe for more stories of justice prevailing against all odds. By the third day of proceedings, the Cleveland County Courthouse had become the epicenter of a legal earthquake that was sending shockwaves through the financial industry. The gallery had swelled to include Jennifer Lee, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, and David Williams, a senior investigator from the SEC, both drawn by the magnitude of Usha Vance's revelations. The morning began with an unexpected motion from the defendant's new lead counsel, Anthony Martinez, who had replaced William Martin overnight. Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming evidence presented by Mrs. Vance, my client wishes to enter into plea negotiations with the federal authorities. The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Thomas Clark, now treating Usha with marked respect, turned to her. "Mrs. Vance, your thoughts on this development?" Usha rose slowly, her worn briefcase once again by her side. "Your Honor, while we appreciate the defendant's willingness to negotiate, there's still more to this story that needs to be brought to light. This case isn't just about one individual or one scheme, it's about a systemic failure that allowed this fraud to flourish." She proceeded to introduce Elizabeth Moore, a former regulatory compliance officer who had tried to raise red flags years ago but had been silenced. Elizabeth's testimony painted a disturbing picture of institutional negligence and willful blindness. "When I first noticed the irregularities," Elizabeth testified, her voice steady but emotional, "I took my concerns to Matthew Thompson, my superior at the time. His response was to remind me that the firm's clients were too big to question and that I should focus on processing paperwork, not playing detective." Usha methodically connected Elizabeth's testimony to a larger pattern of regulatory capture and institutional corruption. The evidence she presented showed how various oversight bodies had failed in their duties, either through incompetence or complicity. Sandra Williams, a forensic accountant working with the Federal Task Force, took the stand next. Her analysis revealed how the fraud had been aided by sophisticated software designed to hide suspicious transactions from routine audits. The level of technological sophistication employed here suggests this wasn't just one person's scheme, it was an institutional effort to deceive. The implications of this testimony were staggering. Robert Wilson, a banking industry compliance expert observing the proceedings, visibly paled as the full scope of the systemic failures became clear. The fraud hadn't just exploited individual victims, it had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the entire financial regulatory system. As the morning progressed, Usha introduced evidence showing how the scheme had spread through respected financial institutions. Margaret Martin, a former bank executive turned state's witness, described how her institution had unwittingly facilitated millions in fraudulent transactions. The genius of their system, Margaret explained, was how it exploited the gaps between different regulatory bodies. They knew exactly where the blind spots were, which jurisdictions communicated poorly with each other, and how to stay just under the thresholds that would trigger deeper investigations. Judge Clark, who had once laughed at Usha's presence in his courtroom, now found himself taking extensive notes on her presentation of systemic vulnerabilities. The case had evolved far beyond a simple fraud trial. It was becoming a landmark exposition of financial industry failures. Karen Rodriguez, a victim who had lost her medical practice's pension fund, stood to testify about how the scheme had affected not just individuals but entire communities. "When our practice went under, we had to lay off 27 people. That's 27 families in our small town directly impacted by this fraud." The human cost of the scheme continued to mount as more victims came forward. Patricia Lewis, a retired school superintendent, described how an entire district's supplementary retirement fund had been decimated. "We're talking about hundreds of teachers who dedicated their lives to educating children only to find their financial security stolen from them." As the afternoon session began, Usha introduced a series of expert witnesses who painted a picture of how the fraud had evolved over time. Barbara Anderson, a banking security expert, demonstrated how the scheme had adapted to exploit new technologies and regulatory changes. "What we're seeing here," Barbara explained, "is not just sophisticated fraud, but a learning organization that actively evolved to stay ahead of detection methods. They studied regulatory changes and adapted their methods accordingly." The testimony of Charles Thomas, a cybersecurity expert, revealed how the organization had used cutting-edge technology to create an elaborate facade of legitimacy. They didn't just fake documents, they created an entire digital ecosystem of false records, fake audit trails, and manufactured verification systems. As Usha connected these technical details to the human impact of the fraud, the courtroom remained spellbound. Nancy Moore, a victim advocate who had been helping coordinate support for those affected, testified about the devastating ripple effects throughout communities. "We're seeing families lose homes, students drop out of college, retired couples forced back into the workforce," Nancy reported. The human cost of this fraud goes far beyond the direct financial losses. The afternoon took an unexpected turn when Lisa Harris, a former employee of the defendant's organization, came forward with additional evidence. Her testimony revealed how the organization had specifically trained its staff to target vulnerable populations using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. "We were taught to look for certain vulnerabilities," Lisa explained, her voice trembling with remorse. "Recent widows, retiring teachers, medical professionals too busy to thoroughly investigate investments. We had scripts designed to exploit their specific fears and hopes. Usha's handling of this testimony demonstrated her remarkable ability to balance justice with compassion. While she didn't shy away from exposing the predatory nature of the scheme, she also acknowledged the complex human factors that had led some employees to participate. James Martinez, another former employee who had become a whistleblower, described the internal culture that had normalized the fraud. It was presented to us as creative financial management. We were told everyone in the industry did it, that it was just how things worked. As the day progressed, Usha introduced evidence showing how the scheme had particularly targeted immigrant communities. Sarah Davis, a community organizer, testified about how language barriers and cultural differences had been exploited to gain trust. They would hire people from within these communities, Sarah explained, using cultural connections to build trust. Then they would exploit that trust to reach entire networks of hardworking immigrants trying to build a future in America. The gallery watched as Usha methodically demonstrated how the scheme had adapted its tactics for different communities. Daniel Clark, a financial crimes investigator, presented analysis showing how the fraud had been customized for different demographic groups. They didn't just translate their materials into different languages, Daniel explained. They created entirely different approaches based on cultural values and community structures. It was sophisticated social engineering on a massive scale. As the day drew to a close, Usha introduced what would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence yet: internal training materials showing how the organization had specifically trained its staff to evade regulatory oversight. Michael Miller, a compliance expert, analyzed these materials for the court. What we're seeing here is not just fraud, but a systematic effort to identify and exploit weaknesses in our financial regulatory system. They created a playbook for circumventing every safeguard we had in place. The implications of this evidence reached far beyond the immediate case. Judge Clark, recognizing the historical significance of the proceedings, ordered all materials to be preserved for future study and regulatory reform efforts. As the court prepared to adjourn, Sandra Johnson, a victim who had lost her retirement savings, approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "what Mrs. Vance has done here isn't just about getting our money back. She's exposed something that needs to change in our entire financial system." The day ended with Usha presenting a preliminary framework for victim restitution, but her final words spoke to the larger implications of the case. What we've uncovered here isn't just about fraud, it's about the need for fundamental reform in how we protect hardworking Americans from financial predators. Have you ever witnessed someone turn personal adversity into a force for positive change? Share your stories of transformation and justice in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the biggest changes start with one person refusing to stay silent. Like and subscribe for more stories of courage and accountability in action. The final day of proceedings dawned with an atmosphere of heightened anticipation. The Cleveland County Courthouse steps were crowded with journalists, including Christopher Brown from the New York Times, all drawn by what had become one of the most significant financial fraud cases in Ohio's history. Inside, the expanded courtroom was filled to capacity, with Richard Wilson, the state's Attorney General, in attendance. Judge Thomas Clark entered the courtroom with a demeanor that contrasted sharply with his dismissive attitude from the first day. His opening remarks set the tone for what would be a historic day in American jurisprudence. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that this court, myself included, has learned a powerful lesson about preconceptions and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Usha Vance rose from her seat, her trusted briefcase beside her. The gallery fell silent as she began her final presentation. "Your Honor, over the past 3 days, we've exposed not just a fraud, but a fundamental breakdown in the systems designed to protect ordinary Americans. Today, we'll demonstrate how this case can serve as a catalyst for meaningful change." She began by introducing Mary Thompson, a reform advocate who had spent years pushing for stronger financial regulations. Mary's testimony provided context for how the exposed fraud fit into a larger pattern of systemic exploitation. What Mrs. Vance has uncovered here isn't an isolated incident, it's a symptom of deeper problems in our financial oversight system. The morning session took an unexpected turn when William Anderson, a senior banking executive, requested to address the court. His testimony revealed how the industry's own practices had created vulnerabilities that fraudsters could exploit. We've been so focused on efficiency and profit that we've neglected our fundamental responsibility to protect our clients. Usha methodically connected these industry admissions to the specific mechanisms of the fraud. Jennifer Clark, a digital forensics expert, demonstrated how the scheme had exploited weaknesses in multiple financial institutions' security systems. They didn't just find gaps in our defenses, they mapped the entire security landscape and designed their fraud to exploit every vulnerability. The testimony of Elizabeth Harris, a former regulatory commissioner, added another layer of significance to the proceedings. What Mrs. Vance has accomplished here goes beyond exposing one fraud scheme. She's provided a blueprint for identifying and preventing similar schemes across the entire financial sector. As the morning progressed, Usha introduced Sandra Martinez, now serving as a spokesperson for the victims' advocacy group that had formed during the trial. Sandra's powerful testimony described how the victims had transformed their pain into purpose. Thanks to Mrs. Vance, we're not just victims anymore, we're advocates for change. The defendant, who had initially smirked at Usha's presence in the courtroom, now sat slumped in his chair as Robert Thomas, his former chief financial officer, testified about the inner workings of the scheme. It was like a cancer that grew within our legitimate business operations, gradually corrupting everything it touched. Patricia Moore, a forensic accountant working with the Federal Task Force, presented findings that showed the true scope of the fraud. The sophisticated nature of this scheme suggests similar operations may be operating undetected in other jurisdictions. Mrs. Vance's methodology provides a new framework for identifying these operations. The afternoon session began with Margaret Davis, the head of a national consumer protection organization, testifying about the broader implications of the case. The precedents established here will strengthen consumer protections across the country. Mrs. Vance hasn't just won a case, she's changed the game. Lisa Robinson, a regulatory compliance expert, detailed how the evidence presented throughout the trial had already sparked reforms in multiple financial institutions. Banks and investment firms across the country are revising their protocols based on the vulnerabilities exposed in this case. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Usha presented her final arguments. She introduced Karen White, a legislative aide, who testified about how the case was inspiring new protective legislation. Lawmakers are already drafting bills based on the systemic weaknesses Mrs. Vance has exposed. The human impact of the case was powerfully illustrated by Nancy Williams, a teacher who had lost her life savings but had since become an advocate for financial literacy. This case has shown us that justice is possible, but it's also taught us the importance of education and vigilance. As the afternoon progressed, Usha introduced evidence of how the case had sparked a national conversation about financial accountability. Sarah Thompson, a social media analyst, presented data showing how the case had resonated with millions of Americans. This isn't just a legal victory, it's become a movement for change. The testimony of Michael Jones, a banking industry reformer, highlighted how the case had already influenced corporate policies. Financial institutions are proactively strengthening their oversight mechanisms, directly responding to the vulnerabilities exposed in this trial. Judge Clark, who had once laughed at Usha's presence, now leaned forward intently as she presented her closing arguments. Your Honor, this case represents more than justice for the victims before us today. It represents an opportunity to prevent countless future victims through systematic reform. Barbara Lewis, a victim who had become an influential advocate during the trial, stood to address the court. What Mrs. Vance has given us isn't just compensation for our losses, it's the tools and knowledge to protect others from similar schemes. The final hours of the trial saw a parade of expert witnesses testifying to the lasting impact of the case. David Clark, a legal scholar, explained how the precedents established would influence future financial fraud cases. This trial has created a new standard for prosecuting complex financial crimes. Susan Jackson, a community organizer who had helped coordinate victim support services, described how the case had brought together diverse communities in pursuit of justice. We've learned that when we stand together, even the most powerful fraudsters can be held accountable. As the day drew to a close, Judge Clark delivered his final ruling. His voice carried the weight of history as he acknowledged how the case had transformed not just his courtroom, but the entire approach to financial fraud prosecution. Mrs. Vance has demonstrated that justice depends not on appearances or preconceptions, but on thorough investigation, unwavering dedication, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The restitution order he issued was unprecedented in its scope, not only compensating victims but establishing mechanisms to prevent future fraud. Anthony Wilson, a financial crimes prosecutor, noted that the ruling would serve as a model for similar cases nationwide. In her final address to the court, Usha remained characteristically humble yet powerful. This victory belongs not to me, but to every person who refused to be silenced, every victim who chose to speak up, and every professional who chose integrity over expediency. As the courtroom began to clear, Linda Martinez, one of the first victims to come forward, approached Usha. "You've shown us that justice isn't just about winning a case. It's about changing the system that allowed the injustice to happen in the first place." The end of the trial marked not a conclusion, but a beginning. Thomas Rodriguez, a legal reform advocate, summarized the sentiment. "What Mrs. Vance has started here will ripple through our financial and legal systems for years to come." The judge who had once laughed at Usha Vance now stood in admiration of her achievement. His final words captured the transformation that had occurred. Sometimes the greatest legal minds come not from prestigious firms or powerful institutions, but from those who have the courage to stand up for justice, regardless of how others may initially perceive them. Have you ever witnessed someone turn mockery into respect through their actions? Share your stories of transformation and triumph in the comments below. Remember, true expertise doesn't need grand introductions, it proves itself through actions and results. Like and subscribe for more stories of justice, transformation, and the power of standing up for what's right.